Many members have asked me consistently how I'm coping with the tears, snotters and tantrums, but I remind them I've been on paternity leave, so I haven't had time to keep up with SNP selection dramas. Mr Speaker, to the question. It's been a historic week for our country, and I know the people of Scotland stand with Ukraine and will recognise the importance of this government's decision to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. The Prime Minister's leadership on the world stage should be a source of pride for all those who value Britain's role as a defender of democracy and a partner for European peace. Scotland has never been more ready to play its part in defending the UK and their allies.
Jack Rankin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Scotland's world-class defence industry will play a key role in rebuilding Britain's military capabilities. On my visit to Babcock at Rosyth, I saw first-hand how defence spending benefits Scotland's SMEs. But investment in Scotland's defence SMEs lags far behind the rest of the United Kingdom, accounting for just 2.5% of the MOD's total spend, largely due to the hostile environment created by the SNP. How is the Secretary of State working with the MOD and Scotland's defence industry to unleash Scotland's SMEs and enhance our nation's defence capabilities?
Mr Speaker, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his question and for the cross-parliament support for the Prime Minister's actions on Ukraine and indeed defence. Scotland needs all its political leaders to proudly stand up for our defence industry. Scotland has led the UK in defence and has been home to its nuclear deterrent since the 1960s. I recently hosted a defence industry roundtable to discuss sector priorities and opportunities, and as part of our Brand Scotland programme, I have discussed those in Norway and South East Asia. I welcome the announcement by the Prime Minister of new SME spending targets for defence. This will boost access to UK defence investment, unlocking new jobs in the process.
Johnny Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that the SNP's reckless pledge to scrap our nuclear deterrent at Faz Lane significantly threatens our national security at a time of significant international and does he agree that Trident, when the First Minister said that Trident has no tangible or realistic benefit to our current security challenges, does the Secretary of State share my view that the stance is fundamentally naive and demonstrates that the SNP cannot be trusted with Scotland's future?
Can I thank the honourable lady for that question? And indeed, the First Minister is all over the place in terms of defence. He suggested that we should increase the 2.5% of GDP on defence spending by scrapping Trident. That's already included in the 2.5%, so would have made no difference whatsoever. They're not credible at all on defence in Scotland, and I would urge everyone in this House, every single party, to get behind the Prime Minister in our national interest.
Dr Scott Arthur.
Question number 2, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Employment Rights Bill will represent the biggest upgrade of workers' rights in a generation, banning zero-hours contracts, ending unscrupulous fire and rehire, day-one protections for paternity leave and against unfair dismissal, better access to statutory sick pay. And with International Women's Day fast approaching, we should remember that it is working women who will disproportionately benefit from this groundbreaking legislation. That's what change looks like. That's the difference a Labour government makes.
Dr Scott Arthur.
I thank the Minister for a reply. Residents right across Edinburgh South West welcome the improvements to workers' rights, but parents in my constituency are really concerned about the impact of the growing gap in attainment in Scottish schools between the richest and poorest, and what that means for their children finding their first job. This week I've been inundated with comments from parents who are concerned about the recent Audit Scotland report on support for children with additional support needs in Scotland. Absolutely disgraceful report. Can the Minister assure me that she will use whatever influence she has to ensure the Scottish Government makes education a priority?
Mr Speaker, my honourable friend rightly raises the concerns of parents worried about their kids getting good jobs. But the SNP have said that a zero-hours contract was a positive destination for a school leaver. This Labour government will ban such exploitative contracts. Labour's budget delivered an extra £4.9 billion for Scottish public services. If after 18 years the SNP still don't see Scottish kids as a priority, they should stand aside and give Scotland the chance for the new direction it deserves.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the Minister for the response, but more importantly, can I thank the honourable gentleman for Edinburgh South West for setting the scene. He's very clearly outlined the issues and the importance to having children and the opportunities for children to be there. So can I ask the Minister, with that in mind, opportunities for children, has the Minister had an opportunity to talk to the equivalent Minister in the Northern Ireland Assembly to discuss how better we can help our children in Northern Ireland, and as you wish to do in Scotland? Thank you.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I haven't had that chance, but I'd be delighted to do so. Scottish education, of course, devolved to the SNP government. I think members on the benches opposite should think long and hard about the fact they've claimed it's their #1 priority, and yet the attainment gap is growing. Working class kids' education exam results were explicitly downgraded by the serving First Minister. We would be delighted to partner with anyone across these islands who wants to increase educational opportunity for our young people.
Rendishman.
Question 3, please, Mr Speaker.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I will answer questions 3, 6, 8 and 10 together. The Scotland Office is playing a key role in driving economic growth in Scotland, ensuring our new industrial strategy works for Scotland, securing Harland and Wolff's future to protect hundreds of jobs in Arnish and Methil, and I led the cross-government ministerial task force to secure £200 million from the National Wealth Fund for Grangemouth. Over the next 10 years, the UK Government will directly invest £1.4 billion in local growth projects in Scotland, from the V&A in Dundee, the town centre of Elgin, a free port in the Forth and local travel in Paisley. Our plan for change will bring growth to every part of Scotland.
Rendishman.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The formal redundancy consultation process started last week for laboratories and stores within the Grangemouth site, with emergency response and other shared service consultations also about to start. These redundancies are due to Petra Ineos serving notice to end shared service contracts because of the imminent refinery closure. The Prime Minister announced a support package guaranteeing workers' incomes for 18 months. So, will the Secretary of State reassure the shared services workers about to lose their jobs in the Grangemouth site because of the refinery closure that they too will be eligible for this package of income guarantee and reskilling support from Forth Valley College?
Mr Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for raising this in the House, as he does, protecting workers in his constituency. The UK Government is fully committed to seeking a sustainable industrial future for Grangemouth and all its workers. Mr Speaker, following the work of the Scotland Office-led task force, the Prime Minister announced the National Wealth Fund will provide £200 million of investment for the Grangemouth site. The UK Government, working with the Scottish Government, is providing a training guarantee for all staff at the refinery to support them into good jobs. And the Honourable Gentleman will be pleased to hear that Unite the Union has welcomed the funding and said that the package, and I quote, safeguards Scotland's energy security and delivers jobs for the future.
Dr Juven Sunder.
Speaker, the defence sector contributes £3.2 billion to the Scottish economy, and Scotland's contribution keeps us all safe. The Prime Minister announced increased defence spending in our country. That also means more investment in Scotland, higher industrial production and higher incomes. So does the Minister agree with me that this shows the difference the Labour government makes both south and north of the border?
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister is absolutely right when he says the first responsibility of this government is to protect our national security and keep our citizens safe. The last time that defence spending was at 2.5% of GDP was under the last Labour government. Scotland is a leader in the defence industry. Just this week I had the pleasure of visiting JFD in Renfrew, who work with the Royal Navy to design, manufacture and operate world-class submarine rescue systems. From Babcock and B&A to small businesses and start-ups, I'm determined that Scotland leads the way in building our military industrial base.
Chris Vins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Given that more than 20,000 jobs in Scotland already support the defence sector, including as well as hundreds of jobs in Harlow, does he agree that the government's commitment to increase defence spending will also help to grow Scotland's economy and create more skilled jobs?
Thanks for that question, Mr Speaker. For years, the defence sector in Scotland has been at the forefront of creating skilled, well-paid jobs, despite the SNP's refusal to stand up and back UK defence. Mr Speaker, this week is of course Scottish Apprenticeship Week as well, and I hope those on all sides of the House, particularly members from Scotland, will join me in paying tribute to Scotland's wonderful defence sector apprentices who do a great job not just keeping our country safe, but helping their economies grow and the skills base of Scotland's future.
Adam Jogi.
Proper industrial strategy is key to economic growth, which is why industry has been asking for this for many years. My constituents in Newcastle Line were failed by the Tories, and the people of Scotland have been failed by the SNP since 2007. Can the Minister set out what work the Scotland Office across government's done to ensure that a national new industrial strategy delivers for Scotland, as well as the good people of Newcastle under Lyme?
Mr Speaker, the SNP, Scottish Government and its members seem to think that defending the defence industry is done on Twitter. Mr Speaker, this government inherited not just a fiscal crisis but an industrial one as well over 10 years without a clear industrial strategy. I was pleased to meet recently with the Chair of the Industrial Strategy Advisory Council and welcomed my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, to Scotland last month to meet business leaders at the forefront of Scotland's industrial future. Already this government has delivered, amongst other things, £200 million for Grangemouth, £2.6 million for the V&A in Dundee, job security for 300 skilled workers at Harland and Wolff shipyards in Bethel and Arnish, and just this morning we announced £55 million for the Cromarty Green Freeport to expand its capability for floating offshore wind. That's a commitment to growth this government makes to the country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The SNP government continues to be opposed to nuclear energy, despite the huge economic benefits that we bring to Scotland. We can see this from the jobs and investment that Torness Power Station generates. So does the Minister agree with me that investing in nuclear would help bring down bills for consumers, help the environment and create many more jobs?
Secretary of State.
I couldn't agree more with the right honourable gentleman. We should be having a nuclear policy in Scotland that allows us to have nuclear power to bring down bills and give us that energy security. And of course, he's also right. The SNP are against nuclear power in Scotland, but they're very happy to take the base load from England.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Mr Speaker, the Scotch whisky industry is central to the economic growth of Scotland, and I was very pleased to hear at the dispatch box yesterday that EFRA are not moving forward with their consultation in relation to single malt. But can the Secretary of State explain why we were in this position in the first place? What consultation was had between EFRA and the Scotland office before this consultation was opened?
I agree to the honourable lady in terms of the commitment that was given by the Chief Secretary of the Treasury at this dispatch box yesterday, and I just reiterate that the only watering down of whisky in Scotland will be the little bit of water that some put in it to taste it.
Mr Speaker, the Secretary of State will be well aware of the manifold range of family businesses, family-owned businesses in Scotland, many of whom are very large, trading multi-million-pound balance sheets every single year. The Chancellor's move to change the rules around business property relief threaten, at best, these businesses potentially getting sold off to PLCs and, at worst, them getting liquidated to pay for their liabilities to HMRC. What assessment has the Scotland Office done on the potentially catastrophic implications for Scottish enterprise of the BPR changes in train from the Treasury?
Mr Speaker, it seems to be that SNP members, when they came back to this chamber back in July, have decided to defend the Conservative government's economic record. We inherited a £22 billion black hole. The Chancellor, when she came to this dispatch box for the budget, had to fill that black hole and end austerity, which is what we promised. It delivered £4.9 billion to the Scottish budget, which the honourable gentleman's party is intent on spending. And Mr Speaker, this is the key point in all of this. This is the key point here. The SNP members in this House have objected to every single measure in that budget, but they're very happy to spend the money.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. If the Secretary of State wants to help economic growth in Scotland, can I suggest he looks at oil and gas? Ending licensing of domestic production, which will not make the slightest difference to how much we consume, will lead to the loss of tens of thousands of jobs, 35,000 jobs, billions of pounds in tax revenue, and we will then import the oil and gas with higher embedded emissions. The Secretary of State knows that's crazy. Can he use it? He can't say so publicly at the dispatch box, but can he use his good offices to persuade his fellow Cabinet members that this is not a sensible course for Scotland?
Mr Speaker, this government backs the oil and gas industry in Scotland. We've consistently said that oil and gas will be with us for decades to come, but that sits across our side. Our national mission to get to clean power by 2030. It's a mission that we should all be backing, not just for the jobs of the future, but to bring down people's bills as well.
Right, Shadow Secretary of State Andrew Bowie.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And can I add my congratulations to that of many others on the birth of the Secretary of State's child just recently. Mr Speaker, I read with some interest that the leader of the Scottish Labour Party is considering publishing a league table to rank the performance of his Scottish Labour MPs. I won't ask the Secretary of State to answer where he thinks he might sit on that table, but I do want to ask about jobs and the economy, specifically in relation to the energy industry. As a direct result of the eco-zealotry emanating from the Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, the increase in the Energy Profits Levy, the ban on new licences and the refusal to even defend the issuing of licences to Rosebank and Jackdaw, there will be a reduction in the total economic value of the oil and gas sector of £13 billion over the next 4 years, with 35,000 direct jobs at risk. Can the Secretary of State tell the House, as Scotland's man in the Cabinet, the man on whom we all rely to make Scotland's case and for Scotland's interests, has he made any overtures to his beleaguered colleague at Desnes, or indeed the Treasury, to stop this madness?
Mr Speaker, the Shadow Secretary of State will know that the Government is working very hard after the Finch decision and the decisions around Rosebank in terms of oil and gas, and he asks me to answer the question about where Scottish Labour MPs would rank in that table. Scottish Labour MPs on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, are in the Premier League. He's in the Sunday League.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And as my right honourable friend says, there's nothing wrong with the Sunday Leagues. Just as he and Scottish Labour were silent on gender recognition, just as he and Scottish Labour are silent on taxing family businesses and farms out of existence, he and Scottish Labour are silent on the loss of an entire industry and its workforce, which will decimate the north-east of Scotland and indeed impact the entire UK economy. So if he and indeed his Scottish Labour colleagues are not standing up for Scotland's interest, for Scottish workers and Scottish industry, can he tell me what just is the point of Scottish Labour?
Mr Speaker, this government is fully committed to economic growth, and as I've said already, the Prime Minister has said and the Chancellor has consistently said oil and gas will be with us for decades to come. We support the industry. We're working through the issues that have been risen by the legal cases that has been referenced by the Shadow Secretary of State, and our Clean Power Mission by 2030 will create jobs, create that economic growth, lower bills and give us that energy security for the future.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. If economic growth in Scotland is to succeed, our world-class universities, the knowledge, the skills and the jobs that they provide will be absolutely vital. But last week, Edinburgh University announced that they face a £140 million deficit, projected to be the largest in the UK. That's hugely concerning for my constituents, and I'm sure also for the Minister. The principals cited several issues, including the national insurance changes. And this morning, visiting universities told Scottish MPs that they also have funding concerns, and they cited the immigration laws in this country as a disincentive. So, can he tell us, please, what the government is going to do to stop further damage to this vital sector, inhibiting economic growth?
Mr Speaker, Scottish universities punch above their weight internationally. They're one of the jewels in the crown of not just the Scottish economy, but the Scottish and UK education system. And of course, Edinburgh University is the best university in the world. You'd expect me to say that as the MP in Edinburgh, but also an alumni itself. Let's not hide from the fact, and I say gently to the Honourable Lady, that part of the big funding challenges with universities is the lack of funding from the Scottish Government, because higher education is devolved. And I also follow that up by very gently saying to the Honourable Lady that, again, she is saying that she doesn't want anything in the budget that raises funds, but wants to spend it.
Stephen Gathins.
Mr Speaker, can I join others in congratulating the Secretary of State on the arrival and the birth of his daughter? That's one gain from Labour that even we can endorse, Mr Speaker. One of the most important areas that business has identified for growth has been around a more Scotland-specific approach to migration. That's something that was touted by Scottish Labour in their manifesto and by their leader, but it was shot down by the UK Government within no time at all, going the same way as WASPI, child poverty commitments and the winter fuel payment commitment. So if the UK Government won't listen to Scotland's Labour leader, why should anybody else?
Mr Speaker, I'm very surprised that the Honourable Gentleman didn't take the opportunity to apologise for his Twitter rantings at the weekend on foreign policy with regards to the Prime Minister, and what he said was the UK has left itself in an utterly isolated position. I think the Honourable Gentleman left himself in an utterly isolated position. This government is completely committed to economic growth, completely committed to transforming lives in Scotland, and we're also already seeing the fruits of that in the Scottish context. And I would ask the SNP to either get behind that or give Scotland a new direction and get out of the way.
Stephen Gathins.
If the Minister had bothered to read any more deeply, I was saying something that he once agreed with. Leaving the EU left us more isolated. He once agreed with me about that before he went into government. But then he agreed with me on other things before he went into government, like tackling fuel poverty, tackling child poverty. Or is the Secretary of State no longer worried about these issues and more worried about league tables? Or a situation where he's more worried about being in the relegation zone? Do you know what's really interesting, Mr Speaker? Throughout all of this, not once has he stood up for his leader. So it makes me think that if we shouldn't listen to his leader because they're not listening to his leader anymore either.
Sorry, Mr Speaker, I lost the thread of that question about halfway through, but the one thing I did take from the question is it was absolutely identical to the question from the Tory Shadow Secretary of State. That tells you all you need to know.
Ross.
Question number 4.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Economic growth is this government's #1 mission. These changes to national insurance contributions are being made in the context of a resilient labour market, with the estimated employment rate up 0.9 percentage points over the last quarter of 2024. We are creating jobs and opportunity through our plan for change and truly making work pay to help raise living standards right across the UK.
Hurry across.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Labour government's decision to hike national insurance is a cost on business before they even open their doors.
Yep.
And in recent months, I've spoken to many businesses across my Gordon Buchan constituency, and each has said to me how worried they are about the changes. In response to my recent business survey, one large business in my constituency said that they're looking to cut up to 25 jobs because of the next changes, and saying that it is beyond belief that the Labour government have decided to do this. Given that this example will be replicated in constituencies across Scotland, including the ministers, can she really stand at this dispatch box and say that she believes in this policy, which so directly hits jobs, employment and growth across Scotland?
Mr Speaker, I do believe in this policy in the same way I believe in all of the announcements that were made in this budget. As so often, members on the opposite benches, they will the ends of the budget, but not the means. If you want the changes to public services that our constituents both rely on, you need to have revenue that pays for it, and that's what this budget was all about. Cleaning up the mess that we inherited and getting investment into the public services that so desperately required.
Graham Downey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. As we know, one of the best ways to grow employment in Scotland is through apprenticeships. A few weeks ago, this UK Labour government announced changes to apprenticeships in England, which will allow businesses to work more closely with colleges and with other skills providers to make sure there's a job at the end of apprenticeships. While in Scotland, all we see is stagnation in skills policy, reducing opportunities for young people in my constituency and across the country. Will she use all her efforts to make sure we press the Scottish Government to properly reform apprenticeships in Scotland to give young people and others the opportunities that they need and deserve?
Mr Speaker, I certainly will, and I'd like to pay tribute to my honourable friend for all that he does to promote apprentices and skills, and in particular the apprentices in our defence industry who are doing so much to keep Scotland, the UK and indeed the world safe.
Andrew Bowis, Shadow Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, the Secretary of State said that the questions just asked were similar. Well, at 2 attempts we didn't get an answer to either of the questions, so we might try on farming. Scotland's beef sector is at the heart of Scottish agriculture, with 80% of the country's agricultural land being grazing land, and yet domestic beef production levels are set to reduce by 5%, with a 12% increase in imports expected to meet our forecasted demand. It's clear this government's tax changes couldn't come at a worse time for Scotland's farmers. So will this Minister please stand up for Scotland's farmers and make the case to stop this madness?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, the honourable gentleman is perfectly aware that currently 73% of agricultural property relief claims each year are for less than 1 million. So almost 3/4 of estates claiming the relief are expected to be entirely unaffected. According to the latest data from HMRC, 40% of APR is claimed by just 7% of estates making claims. That means that just 117 estates across the UK were claiming over 200 million of relief in 2021-22. Farmers will be able to pass down their family farm to future generations, just as they always have done.
Susan Murray.
Question 5, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Properly funding public services and restoring economic stability requires difficult decisions on tax, which is why we are asking employers to contribute more. Stabilising the public finances is the only way to create long-term stability in which businesses can thrive. The Government does recognise the need to protect the smallest businesses, which is why we have more than doubled the employment allowance to £10,500, meaning more than half of small businesses will either gain or be unaffected.
Sit down. Susan Murray. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. One of my constituents has told me about one of their clients who's a business care home owner, which is facing an increase in their operating costs of £70,000 a year as a result of the national insurance increase. Most of their caring staff work on a part-time basis, which suits their family circumstances. However, for each part-time member of staff, the business must pay an additional £615 per year as a result of the change to the national insurance contribution thresholds in the government's October budget. Dunbartonshire and across the UK, there's a growing demand for social care. So, what is the government going to do to help businesses in the care sector who've been hit by these increased staffing costs at a time when there are significant rises?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure the honourable member from Dunbartonshire and members on all sides of this House will join me in paying tribute to Scotland's social care workers for the incredible contribution that they make. Social care is, of course, a devolved issue. The Scottish Government has now received the largest budget settlement in the whole history of devolution, in addition to support for additional employer national insurance costs. They can choose to, and indeed I very much hope they do, deliver additional support for social care.
You'll stand by.
Speaker, the impact of NIC changes in the budget is £5.2 billion more for Scotland. Record funding to invest in our NHS, protect the successes of devolution and fix our local services. But the Scottish Government have squandered the latter opportunity by continuing to underfund our councils, leaving Falkirk Council with a £28 million hole to plug after 8 years of SNP control. Does the Minister agree with me that the £5.2 billion secured for Scotland by these benches could have been used to fix local government, but instead the SNP have chosen to leave the people of Falkirk to pick up the bill?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not only do I agree with my honourable friend that the SNP government is at risk of squandering this historic opportunity for Scotland, I suggest the SNP government might like to ask their members of Parliament opposite why they voted against this historic budget in Scotland's interests.
We now come to Prime Minister's questions. Samir Khan.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, tomorrow marks 13 years since 6 young British soldiers were on patrol in Afghanistan when their vehicle was struck by an explosive, tragically killing them all. Sergeant Nigel Coop was 33. Corporal Jake Hartley was 20. Private Anthony Frampton was 20. Private Daniel Wade was 20. Private Daniel Wilford was 21. And Private Christopher Kershaw was just 19, a teenager. Tomorrow also marks the 18th anniversary of the death of Benjamin Reddy, a 22-year-old serving with 42 Commando Royal Marines, killed in Helmand Provost in 2007. These men fought and died for their country, our country. And across the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, 642 individuals died fighting for Britain alongside our allies. Many more were wounded. We will never forget their bravery and their sacrifice. And I know the whole House will join in me in remembering them and all those who serve our country. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has rightly made growth his key mission, but can he outline for my constituents in Southampton Test how our Employment Rights Bill will not only deliver improvements for them, but also put more money in their pockets as part of our plan?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. She's doing a fantastic job for her constituents. The Employment Rights Bill is the biggest upgrade to workers' rights in a generation. It will benefit more than 10 million workers in every corner of the country. It will tackle low pay, poor conditions and poor job security that hold our country back. It is pro-worker, pro-business and pro-growth.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Divisions between Ukraine and the US only serve Vladimir Putin. President Zelensky is right to try and rebuild his relationship with President Trump. He is keeping a cool head under very difficult circumstances, and I was glad to see President Trump receive his letter positively. What is the Prime Minister doing to help rebuild their relationship after a challenging week?
Minister.
Well, she's absolutely right that we need to do everything we can to ensure that the US, Europe and Ukraine are working together on lasting peace. And I'm doing everything I can to play my part in that, in regular contact with all of the key players at the moment, including talking to President Zelensky yesterday afternoon.
Kemi
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for that answer. All of us in this House know that the British Armed Forces are a huge source of pride to our country. They put themselves in harm's way to defend our values. As the opposition, we support efforts to resolve this conflict, but we cannot write a blank cheque. If British peacekeeping troops in Ukraine were attacked, whether directly or via proxies, we could be drawn into conflict with Russia. Can the Prime Minister reassure all those who are concerned about the UK being drawn into war?
Minister.
Yes, that's the last thing anybody wants to see. And the whole point of ensuring that there's a lasting peace and that any deal, if there's a deal, is defended, is to avoid conflict, to ensure that we do have peace. The way to ensure we have peace is to ensure there are guarantees for any deal that is in place, because the surest risk that there will be conflict is if Putin thinks that he can breach any deal that may be arrived at.
The Prime Minister is quite right, and we on this side of the House agree with him. The objective for his visit to Washington was to get that US security guarantee for Ukraine, and I commend his efforts in this very difficult task. But nonetheless, on Monday, the United States withdrew military aid for Ukraine. Can he update the House on the steps he is taking to persuade America that it is also in their national interest to provide a security guarantee?
Prime Minister.
I'm pleased to inform the House that on Thursday of last week we did discuss security guarantees. The President made absolutely clear his commitment to Article 5 of NATO, absolutely clear that he would have our backs because of the relationship between our parties, and agreed that our teams would sit down together to talk through security guarantees. I've spoken to him, I think, 3 times since then on the telephone, because it is vitally important that we work with the US, with Europe and Ukraine and make sure that if there is a deal, it has proper security guarantees in place.
Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, I know the Prime Minister is not able to comment on specific intelligence matters, and I'm certainly not asking him to do that. However, there are concerning reports that the United States has instructed Britain to suspend intelligence sharing with Ukraine, and other reports that Five Eyes itself may be at risk. We need to make sure America does not disengage. There are some in this House who argue Europe should go it alone. But does he agree with me that without this country's greatest ally, any peace agreement would place a terrible burden on Britain and our taxpayers?
Prime Minister.
Well, I do agree with her wholeheartedly, and that's why in the debate we had just 2 days ago, I've always been clear that we need to ensure that the US, the UK, Europe and Ukraine are working together, but we must not choose between the US and Europe. We never have historically, and we're not going to do so now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his comments on that. He will know that it is not just the security situation that worries people. They are also concerned about trade wars and the economic impact of tariffs, like those levelled on Canada and Mexico yesterday. The best way to avoid America putting tariffs on Britain is to reach agreement on a US trade deal. Following the Prime Minister's trip to Washington, have talks on a UK-US trade deal begun?
Prime Minister.
Well, I was pleased in the meeting I had last week that we did discuss an economic deal and agreed that our teams would indeed sit down rapidly to talk through an economic deal, and that is what they're doing, because, as she rightly says, that is far better than getting drawn into conflict in relation to tariffs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad the Prime Minister has confirmed that those talks have started. People across our country are worried. They're worried about national security. They're worried about whether we can equip our military fast enough. They are worried about whether we will deploy troops in Ukraine and whether we will be able to keep the peace. They are also worried about our economic security. Can we afford all this? The world is changing fast, and we need an entirely new approach to our economy and our energy security. The budget last year halted growth with higher taxes and higher borrowing. Yesterday, farmers were protesting in Whitehall again. People are hurting. Will he now change course so we can have the economic security we know we need for our national security?
Prime Minister.
We were doing so well. What we inherited was insecurity in our economy. We inherited a £22 billion black hole, and we have now turned that around. We've got the highest investment coming into our economy. We've got wages higher than prices. We've got 3 times interest rates have been cut. That's the difference between stability with Labour and instability with the party opposite.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend the Prime Minister for his decisive leadership that he has shown in Europe and at home to bolster our collective security. The £13.4 billion increase in defence spending has been very much welcomed in my constituency of Stevenage. Can the Prime Minister outline how that increase in defence spending will boost jobs and growth in places like Stevenage, and would he like to join me in visiting some of those businesses?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for his question. Our plan for change is built on national security, and that has to go hand in hand with economic security. And as we're returning to 2.5% for the first time since a Labour government, that investment must mean UK skills, UK jobs and UK apprenticeships. And I was very pleased that on Monday we were able to announce a new hub, and new spending targets to help 12,000 SMEs access the supply chain, which will boost economic growth, and that will be really important in so many constituencies. And of course, I'll consider his invitation.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I visited Kingston's Army Reserve Centre, met members of the Royal Army Medical Service who'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan very bravely. So can I associate myself with the Prime Minister's initial remarks? On Monday, the Prime Minister rightly said a minerals deal only was not a sufficient security guarantee for Ukraine. But since then, the Trump administration has said that a minerals deal is the only guarantee on the table, and President Trump has removed military aid from Ukraine and said that the British cannot share American intelligence with Kyiv. Both those decisions mean more brave Ukrainians will die and further embolden Vladimir Putin. So can the Prime Minister tell the House, does he still believe that President Trump is a reliable ally? And if Ukraine does not get a sufficient security guarantee from this White House, what is the Prime Minister's plan B?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, look, we work very closely with the United States on defence, on security and on intelligence. We have done for many, many years. We're intertwined, and of course they're a reliable ally. We are operating on that basis day in, day out across the world, as he knows. In relation to the situation as it develops, obviously our main focus, our only focus, is on a lasting peace in Ukraine. There are many moving parts, there are many discussions to be had, but what I'm doing is staying focused on what I think is the single most important outcome, which is a lasting peace in Ukraine, which is good for Ukraine, for Europe, and of course essential for the United Kingdom.
Sir Ed Davey.
The Prime Minister knows we all support him in that effort. But can I take him back to President Trump's reliability? 4 British women have accused Andrew Tate of rape and human trafficking, and British police have issued arrest warrants. The Tates have tried to escape justice, first to Romania and now to the United States, but I'm delighted that Florida has thankfully opened a criminal investigation. But does the Prime Minister agree that people who are wanted by British police of such appalling crimes should stand trial in our country? And given his assessment that President Trump really is a reliable ally, will his government request an urgent extradition of the Tate brothers?
Prime Minister.
This is a live issue, as he'll appreciate, and therefore I'll tread carefully. But the principle is absolutely clear. Justice must be done in all cases, including in this case. But I won't go into the details because this is a live case, as he knows.
Steve Race.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm supporting many parents in Exeter who are struggling to get the support they need for their children within the SEND system run by Devon County Council. One parent told me that their child was excelling, but after undergoing major surgery, she needed additional support to get back into a mainstream school setting. That hasn't been possible due to the disarray of the SEND system in Devon, and this child is now missing out. I welcome the new money going to the system. Can the Prime Minister provide an update on government work work that will also reform the SEND system to make sure every child in Exeter has the best start in life.
Prime Minister.
Well, thank him for raising this familiar topic. We inherited a SEND system that failed to meet the needs of children and families, and that's why we're investing £1 billion in SEND alongside £740 million for councils to improve inclusivity and expertise in mainstream schools and to make sure special schools can cater for children with the most complex needs. We're working closely with partners in Devon to deliver an accelerated progress plan and have deployed SEND advisors to offer support to the local authority.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
By cozying up to Putin, Trump is making Europe less safe. We all recognise the need for Europe to adapt. Germany is changing its fiscal rules to boost investment in defence and infrastructure, creating a €500 billion fund to strengthen its future. Will the Prime Minister please consider a similar approach, focusing on strategic investment rather than imposing further hardship on the poorest through cuts to welfare and cuts to international aid?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as she knows, I think it's very important if we're to increase defence spending, which we are, to have that fully costed, fully funded, and to put that plan before the House, which is what I did last week. But she talks about fiscal rules, she talks about funding. I have to say, it was highly regrettable that Plaid voted against £1.6 billion to fund public services in Wales. She needs to explain how that helps her constituents and the people of Wales.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This year marks 40 years since the Swan Report exposed systemic racism and discrimination in the education system. And regrettably, none of those recommendations were implemented. One of the most damning injustices in that report was the misclassification of mainly black children as educationally subnormal, as identified in Steve McKean's BBC documentary. And given the historic nature of this and the impact it had on so many, will the Prime Minister consider a public inquiry to provide justice and recompense for those who have been affected?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank her for raising this really important issue. All children, young people, must be treated fairly, and there's no place for hate or prejudice in our education system. I'll make sure she gets a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss this further.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, President Trump has ended military aid to Ukraine, reportedly banned the UK share in US intelligence for Ukraine, and is now seeking to lift sanctions with Russia to appease Vladimir Putin, a murderous, lying dictator. Regrettably, it's clear for now the US can no longer be relied upon for security and peace in Europe. So will the Prime Minister provide leadership to our allies by urgently making the decision to be the first leader to release seized Russian state assets to Ukraine under the established principle of international law, so that Putin must pay as the aggressor?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on the question of assets, obviously we're using the profits, the interest on the assets to help fund Ukraine, and we are looking with others at whether it's possible to go further, and obviously I'll update the House if that's possible. But I have to say, at a time when defence and security in Europe, in the UK, needs to be ramped up for all the reasons that he readily understands, for the SNP to maintain its position that it wants to get rid of the single most effective deterrent that we have, the nuclear deterrent, really has to be explained in its historical context.
Paul Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour is rolling out free breakfast clubs in primary schools, starting with 750 schools, including Scapegoat Hill Junior Infants School in my constituency. Under the Tories, only 1 in 10 schools had these clubs. Labour will make them available for all children. This will help break down barriers to opportunity for every child. I know the Prime Minister is as determined as I am to tear away the link between background and success. So will you update the House on how we are going to do that through Labour's plan for change?
Minister.
Well, I thank him for his question. Labour promised free breakfast clubs in every primary school, and the first 750 will open in April, giving every child the best start in life through our plan for change. It will also put up to £450 a year back in the pockets of working families. I'm delighted, Mr Speaker, to say that 2 of the breakfast clubs will be opening in the constituency of the Leader of the Opposition in April, and I hope she'll welcome them when they do.
Ian Solomon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On Monday, the Prime Minister talked about creating defence jobs across the country as we rebuild our defence industrial capacity. So will he and the government bring forward an urgent plan for skills in the defence sector? And does he agree with his Education Secretary that the strategy for defence skills should sit purely under the Department for Education and an underpowered executive agency?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising this because it is a duty to increase our spending on defence and security, but it also does provide an opportunity for jobs across the country, and that's good jobs, well-paid jobs, skilled jobs, as he rightly identifies, but also jobs with a real sense of pride, and we are working on that.
Emma Lulberg.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My lovely granddad, John Henry Richardson, passed away in 1998 from work-related asbestos exposure. Today in South Shields, we have one of the highest death rates from this silent killer in the United Kingdom. Will the Prime Minister please look at introducing a national digital register so we know where this asbestos is and commit to a phased removal of it from public buildings?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm sure I speak for the whole House when I say I'm very sorry to hear what happened to her grandfather. These are just awful cases, and the deaths are terrible. I've no doubt he was a wonderful man. He would have been, no doubt, very proud to have seen her in her place today. And I'll make sure that she gets a meeting with the relevant minister.
Sir Oliver Dundon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. St Hilda's Girls' School looks set to join a manual Jewish prep as the second school in Bushey alone forced to close because of Labour's VAT hike. This is a double hit to aspiration. First, the parents, many of whom not wealthy, who have described the significant sacrifices they have made to send their children to these schools. And secondly, to the excellent local state schools, including the one that I attended, which simply do not have the places, meaning this policy won't even save money. So may I therefore urge the Prime Minister, even at this late stage, to look again at the failures in this policy.
I don't doubt the aspirations of all parents in relation to their children. But I mean all parents. What we've been able to do is to make sure we release the funding to ensure that our state secondary schools have the teachers they need. And there's no point the party opposite pretending that they're interested in state education when they left them without the teaching they needed.
Dr. Richard Ball.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
There is no punchline. I presume something was said that shouldn't have been said. I'm sure the member would like to withdraw what was said, if they've anything about them. Withdrawn. There we are. Let's carry on. Dr. Maria Timbon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. 48 children that we know of have been killed by known domestically abusive parents during court-permitted contact visits, including Paul and Jack Seitz, who were tragically murdered at the hands of their father in a house fire. Their mother, my constituent Claire Throssell, has campaigned against the presumption of contact, which allows such abusers to have unsupervised contact with their children. Will the Prime Minister meet with Claire and I to discuss the urgent need to remove the presumption of contact in law?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I pay tribute to my honourable friend and to my honourable friend, the member for Calder Valley, who've both raised this critical issue? And can I particularly pay tribute to Claire? Her courage and strength is outstanding. Mr Speaker, family courts must never be used as a tool that domestic abusers can use to continue their appalling abuse. And we're expanding a number of pathfinder courts to protect the welfare of children and reviewing the presumption of involvement that she raises.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Daniel Coffey from Columpton lost his life while serving in Iraq.
His grandfather said yesterday that Vice President JD Vance should have a lot more respect for those who lost their lives, in response to the Vance comment that some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. Will the Prime Minister gently remind the US government the UK was there for the US following the 9/11 attacks when Lord Robertson invoked Article 5, and that we were there for the US for the intervention in Iraq? And they might remember our long-standing friendship when we think about security guarantees for Ukraine.
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising this, and I know he speaks for the whole House. We do remember the role that we've played historically with our allies, and we particularly remember those that made the ultimate sacrifice in that duty for their country and for our allies, and that's why it's so important that we make that point today.
Muraz Gul Peran Lowen. Happy St Piran's Day, Mr Speaker. To the hundreds of thousands of people in Cornwall and around the world who are today celebrating St Piran's Day, will the Prime Minister confirm our government's commitment to national minority status for Cornwall, and will he join me in wishing Cornish folk the world over a very happy St Piran's Day?
Prime Minister.
Well, yes, let me wish him, his constituents and everyone in Cornwall a very happy St Piran's Day. We do recognise Cornish national minority status, not just the language, the history and the culture of Cornwall, but its bright future. And I know that he and Cornish colleagues will continue to be powerful voices for Cornwall.
Sir David Davis.
Four weeks ago, the Northern Ireland coroner accused British soldiers of unlawful killing after they engaged with IRA would-be murderers. After careful reading, as far as I can see, this judgment was based on no evidence whatsoever. Over 100 Special Forces soldiers have been summoned before these inquiries. Not one IRA leader has been summoned in the same way. Soldiers that serve our country with honour, heroism and skill are being punished in their declining years for doing nothing but carrying out their patriotic duty facing enormous risks. Now, given how he opened his comments today, which I associate myself with, does he not think that he and his government have a duty to protect these soldiers from such partisan parodies of justice in their declining years?
On the particular case, the coroner's ruling, I just haven't seen the details, I'm afraid, so I can't comment on that. On the broader point, it's right that we should protect those who serve our country, wherever they serve our country. Getting the balance right is critically important. I didn't think that the legislation that was put forward by the party opposite achieved that, but nonetheless, I do believe that in the interests of everybody in Northern Ireland, all those who served and all those who are victims, we do need to renew our efforts to find a way forward on this really important issue.
Helena Donegal.
Mr Speaker, my constituents in Hastings Rye and the villages are fed up with the constant failures of Southern Water, dumping sewage in our sea, flooding and leaving us without water for days, all while taking huge bonuses. At the Environment Select Committee, we've been hauling in the water bosses one by one and hearing about their failures. But the boss of Southern Water there finally agreed to give my constituents millions in compensation for a major water outage. Can the Prime Minister tell me how this Labour government is cracking down on the bad behaviour of the water industry?
Can I applaud her for her dedicated work on the Environment Committee and obviously in her constituency. Last week, our Water Act became law, which gives new powers to ban the payment of bonuses for polluting water bosses and bringing criminal charges against lawbreakers. We are determined, Mr Speaker, to fix our broken water system after years of companies pumping sewage into our waterways and infrastructure not keeping pace with demand.
Wendy Morton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I pay tribute to the Prime Minister for his efforts to bring Europe together and ensure we can work to restore peace in Ukraine. What the war in Ukraine has also demonstrated, though, is the need for greater food security and stronger supply chains. But if this government forces our farmers to sell their land because of the divisive family farm tax, then it undermines this. So ahead of the spring statement, I'd like to ask the Prime Minister, will he think this policy through again and seek to end it? Because national security needs food security, it needs farming, and it needs farmers.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we put a record amount in the budget into farming, £5 billion. We've set out a roadmap for farming, which has been welcomed across by the NFU. And as she knows, the vast majority of farms will not be affected by the provisions that we're putting in place.
Lead picture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For months, my constituents in Doncaster East and Isle of Axholme have been telling me how fed up they are with not being able to get an appointment because of the 8 a.m. scramble. The last thing they need when they're ill is to have to pick up that phone and wait and fight again to be first. It's great news that the government's new GP contract will start to resolve this. But can the Prime Minister reassure my residents who can't use technology that they will still be able to book an appointment?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for this. Last week, for the first time in 4 years, the BMA agreed the GP contract with the government worth an extra £889 million. Patients will be able to request appointments online from October, but I can absolutely reassure my honourable friend and others that this will free up the phones for those who need them most and help end the 8 a.m. scramble.
Rosie Duffy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under his Labour government, does the Prime Minister believe the UK's estimated 3 million millionaires should contribute more to our vital national security? Or is it just the world's poorest by no longer benefiting from our international aid programmes, or the shameful almost 6 million children living in poverty in this country who should be paying for it? What happened to the wealth tax, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister.
Well, I think all should and all do make a contribution at this vital time.
Mike Tapp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These are delicate moments for the country, and the Prime Minister has led with British values, moral courage, decency, as a true statesman, and with skilled and careful diplomacy. All elected politicians in this House, Mr. Speaker, must appreciate that everything we say could impact that diplomacy. Does the Prime Minister agree that a united House could help us achieve that lasting peace?
Well, let me broaden out his words to the whole House, because I do think that it's hugely to the credit of this House that it is speaking loudly in a united way with one voice in the face of Russian aggression. And that is why we must have lasting peace based on the sovereignty and security of Ukraine. But it certainly helps to all of those observing across the world to see this House speaking powerfully with one voice, united across these benches, and I'm very pleased that we're able to continue in that way.
Seamus Logan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Scottish fishing industry, by volume and value, is the biggest in these islands. And within my constituency, the port towns of Peterhead and Fraserburgh represent a very large share of that industry in terms of the land it catch and its processing. Now, I'm sure the Prime Minister enjoys the occasional fish supper. So does he agree that their interests and their future must be secured and enhanced as his government pursues economic growth and resets its relationship with the European Union, especially through the forthcoming trade and cooperation agreement negotiations, so that the jobs of the people who work in this sector can never be made expendable for the sake of some other interest?
Prime Minister.
Well, thank you for raising this, and do recognise the huge and historic importance of the fishing industry in his constituency and others. I'm determined to make the sector more secure, sustainable and economically successful. We've already secured over 720,000 tonnes of fishing quota for the year, worth up to £920 million, including agreements with the EU and with Norway. We also want to tackle problems about labour shortages that he will be familiar with. I'm pleased that his constituents in Peterhead will benefit from £20 million under our plan for neighbourhood, but absolutely do everything we can in relation to this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Medway Maritime Hospital in my constituency of Gillingham and Raynham has today received a very concerning CQC report following an inspection of the emergency department in February last year. Testimonies include patients having to wait up to 50 hours to be seen and others being told to soil themselves because there were staff that were not available to take them to the bathroom. Will the Prime Minister please outline what this government will urgently do to tackle the crisis in our NHS after 14 years of absolute Tory mismanagement?
Prime Minister.
Well, thank her for raising this case. Her constituents deserve the highest standard of care. The party opposite left the NHS in an absolutely dire state. We're investing £26 billion and our reform plan will cut waiting lists. And I'm really pleased, Mr. Speaker, to say that waiting lists are down and we've delivered over 2 million extra appointments to get the NHS back on its feet.
Final question, Richard Holden.
Thank you very much. A marriage between first cousins carries significant health issues, many of which aren't even knowable until post-birth. When practiced generation after generation, there is a significant multiplier effect. In addition, the real impacts for the openness of our society and women's rights in our country are also significant. After all, there are significant dynamics in sharing a same set of grandparents. On Friday, this government has a choice to let my bill go through to ban first cousin marriage to committee stage. Will the Prime Minister think again before instructing his whips to block this legislation?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've taken our position on that bill. Thank you.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. Right, we now come to the statement. Lord Chancellor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will make a statement on capacity in the Crown Court. When this government took office 8 months ago, we received an inheritance from those opposite that was little short of disgraceful. Our prisons were in crisis, on the edge of collapse, and our courts faced a record and rising backlog. While the crisis in our prisons was more obvious and visible, the harm caused by the backlog in our courts cannot be overestimated. Today, the backlog stands at over 73,000 cases. Just 5 years earlier, it had been half of that figure. We should stop and consider that fact, because the backlog is far more than a number. Behind each case is a victim. Many have waited years for justice, and some will now not have their cases heard until 2028. With delays this long, it is little wonder that more victims are dropping out. And tragically, this is true of victims of the most heinous crimes. Just 5 years ago, around 3% of adult rape victims whose cases were due to go to trial dropped out before their case was heard. Today, that figure has more than doubled. Mr. Speaker, an old adage has sadly come true in this country. For far too many, justice delayed is justice denied. Unlike our predecessors who allowed this backlog to rise and rise, this government will bear down on it. We will deliver swifter justice for the victims of crime, and that starts today with a record investment in our criminal courts. Mr Speaker, each financial year the Government determines the total number of days that can be sat across all our courts and tribunals, commonly referred to as sitting days. This process is called the Concordat, and last year I committed to concluding the process earlier than in previous years to give our courts greater certainty. We have now done so several months ahead of last year's settlement. And so today, I can announce that this government will provide a total budget of £2.5 billion for our courts and tribunals in the next financial year. Mr Speaker, this represents a record level of investment. It will fund up to 110,000 sitting days in our Crown Courts. This is 4,000 more days than the previous government funded last year. And if the Shadow Minister opposite would like to check the record books, he will find no higher allocation in recorded history. Beyond the Crown Court, investment in the family and civil courts brings those jurisdictions at or close to their maximum capacity. And this investment in court capacity is matched by an investment in court maintenance. Our courts have been allowed to fall into a shocking state of disrepair in recent years. And so this government will boost funding to £148.5 million, up from £128 million last year. This will be the highest figure spent on maintenance and capital works in the last 10 years. Mr Speaker, this builds on a consistent theme of this new government and a marked difference when compared to our predecessors. In our first 8 months in office, we have consistently invested more in the courts than the last Conservative government. On entering office, I immediately funded 500 sitting days on top of the allocation provided by the previous Lord Chancellor. At the end of last year, when resources allowed, I added a further 2,000. In October, this government also increased magistrates' court sentencing powers. Previously, they could only impose a 6-month prison sentence, and we lifted this to 12 months. In doing so, we freed up capacity in the Crown Court to hear the most serious cases. This single change was equivalent to adding another 2,000 sitting days in our Crown Courts. Mr Speaker, all these changes are necessary for the swift delivery of justice. However, I must be honest in a way that my predecessors never were. This investment is necessary but not sufficient to reduce the Crown Court backlog. Even with record levels of funding, if we do not take other bolder measures, the backlog will grow. With a growing number of cases entering our courts and with cases of increasing complexity being heard in front of our judges, we cannot simply do more of the same. We must do things differently. So in December, I appointed Sir Brian Levison, one of our most distinguished judges, to conduct a wholesale review of our criminal courts. The review will propose long-term reform, as well as reviewing the efficiency and timeliness of court processes from charge all the way to case completion. But crucially, I've also asked him to address something that too many others have avoided, the question of structural reform. Today, 10% of criminal cases are heard in a Crown Court, where a judge presides and a jury decides. Mr Speaker, jury trials are a pillar of our justice system for the most serious offences, and that will never change. However, we must ask ourselves whether there are cases that we are hearing today that could be handled equally well elsewhere. There are already some cases that can be heard in either a Crown or a Magistrates' Court. We call these trialable either-way cases. Today, they represent 40% of the court's backlog. But while a conviction, whether determined by a jury or a magistrate, is the same, regardless of the type of courtroom, the demand that they place on our justice system is very different indeed. An either-way case is resolved by magistrates 5 times faster than before a judge and jury. Now, justice must be done. Criminals must always face consequences. On that, I know this House will agree. But we must be willing to ask whether a judge and jury should be occupied at great length and expense on crimes that could be dealt with more swiftly elsewhere. For that reason, I've asked Sir Brian to consider the case for reclassifying some less serious offences, whether magistrate sentencing powers are sufficient, and the case for a new court to sit between the magistrates and the Crown. Sir Brian's recommendations will come later this spring. His goal and mine are one: to bear down on the backlog and deliver swifter justice for victims. The consequences of failing to do so are all too clear. The backlog in the criminal courts will rise. Cases will be listed even further into the future. More victims of crime will decide the wait is too painful with justice so distant, and as a result, dangerous criminals will walk free. So today we've announced a record investment in our courts, 110,000 sitting days funded, 4,000 more than the previous administration. For many victims, their case will be heard sooner. But if we are to deliver swifter justice for all, we must embrace reform too. This government will deliver once-in-a-generation reform of our courts. We will reverse the decline and the delays of the last Conservative government, and I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you. I can always help by reopening Chorley Court for you. Right, let us come to this yellow Lord Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's great to see the Justice Secretary back in the country after her holiday in Texas. If she can find time to travel to America, why can't she find time to travel to the 2 Category A prisons that the independent... well, I'd be pleased to hear from the Right Honourable Lady that's the case. That wasn't the answer to our written parliamentary question the other day. But, Mr. Speaker, today, the Central Criminal Court has 13 courtrooms sat empty. In Preston, 40% of courtrooms sit empty. In Winchester, it's 2/3. And as a result of the court backlog, that has grown under the Justice Secretary. We need to be maximising court capacity, taking full advantage of all available days and probing the judiciary for options to create more capacity. I know that. I'd like to believe that the Right Honourable Lady knows that. But how did we get here? Well, we got here because... No. We got here because, just like every other area of this Labour government, it came to office with no plan whatsoever. And it has wasted its first 8 months in office. Upon entering office, the Lady Chief Justice informed the Justice Secretary there were at least 6,500 sitting days available to address the court backlog. The Lord Chancellor responded by adding a measly 500 sitting days. The court backlog kept growing. So frustrated was the Lady Chief Justice that she came to Parliament in November and took the unusual step of publicly chastising the Justice Secretary, and she reiterated her offer of 6,500 sitting days. The Justice Secretary responded a month later by adding 2,000 sitting days. The court backlog kept growing. And here we are, again, 8 months on from the Justice Secretary taking office, on the very day that the Public Accounts Committee published an excoriating report into her department to promise more sitting days. So, Mr. Speaker, is it third time lucky for the Justice Secretary? No. What we've learned again today is that the Justice Secretary is still turning down available sitting days. And that, astonishingly, she has conceded that the court backlog will keep on rising. This is simply not acceptable. So, of course, I welcome the changes made by the Justice Secretary, but it is not enough. She says that victims will get quicker justice. Well, tell that to the victims of rape who are having their court cases listed for 2028.
Order. Please, I need to be able to hear it. When you shout, when the front bench is shouting so long I can't hear, I'll decide whether it's in order or not. Are we understanding each other? Please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't pretend that cutting the court backlog is easy or that it will be quick. But the Secretary of State owes the country a plan and a timetable for when the backlog is actually going to fall. This morning, she was repeatedly asked, but refused to give an answer. So can she tell the country now? When will the court backlog begin to fall? By what date does her department forecast it falling? And why will she not take up the 2,500 additional sitting days offered time and time again by the Lady Chief Justice? And lastly, turning to the new sentencing guidelines that's been published alongside this statement, which will make a custodial sentence less likely for, and I quote, ethnic minorities, cultural minorities, and faith minority communities, Why is the Justice Secretary enshrining this double standard, this two-tier approach to sentencing? This is an inversion of the rule of law. We on this side of the House believe in equality under the law. Why doesn't she?
So state.
Mr. Speaker, the Shadow Secretary of State asked the question, how did we get here? I'll tell him how we got here. His administration and the 14 years they had in power and the absolute mess they made of the criminal justice system, a mess that this government is clearing up. I'm sorry to deprive him of what I'm sure he thought was a clever attack line on my recent visit to Texas. I can inform him I have in fact visited Manchester Prison. I did so during the February recess. And...
Please. I did say to the side, I do need to hear, so please.
And he should welcome us seeking to learn from a tough law and order state in America where they had the same problems that we inherited from his administration 20 years ago, and where they've embarked on criminal justice reform that has seen levels of reoffending a low level that we could only dream of thus far in this country. So he should seek to learn from other countries, as we are doing. If his government had done so when they were in power, we wouldn't have such a big mess to clear up in the criminal justice system. He refers to courtrooms sitting empty. One of the reasons why so many of those courtrooms have been sitting empty is because his government, one of their last acts on leaving office, was to only fund 106,000 sitting days. I have lifted that amount. Today is a record number of Crown Court sitting days, the highest ever that will be funded by this Labour government. So more of those courtrooms are, of course, going to be put to use. He will also know that in order to run the system efficiently, there will always be some courtrooms not in use so that they can cope with the influxes of demand. That is the normal practice for how we run. But more courtrooms, as a result of this decision today, will be in use than was ever the case under his administration. He asks me what I have been doing and what is the plan. Well, let me tell him, when I first came into office, the first thing I did was increase the number of sitting days by 500. His government left office at 106,000. I increased it immediately. I then made a further allocation and increased again by another 2,000 before Christmas, making progress on dealing with the Crown Court's backlog and picking up the pieces of the mess that his government left behind. He'll know that the changes I made to Magistrates' Court sentencing powers also have freed up capacity in the Crown Courts, and we have increased funding for legal aid, criminal legal aid, by 92 million so that we have the money to underpin the system. That is action. That is an increase in sitting days in year and an unprecedented increase in sitting days for the next year. That's what this Labour government is delivering. And he will also know that even if we were sitting at the maximum judicial capacity, which is right to refer to, the Lady Chief Justice has referenced in Parliament herself, even at maximum judicial capacity, that backlog is still going to rise. And that is because the demand coming into the system is fast outstripping the pace at which cases are being disposed of. And so knowing that, it would be unconscionable if I stood before this House and behaved as if resources alone were going to fix the problem. That is why Sir Brian Leveson is considering once-in-a-generation reform of our Crown Courts. It's the combination of the steps I've already taken, the funding I've now allocated, and the review that will lead to once-in-a-generation reform. That's what a plan looks like to fix the mess his government left behind. It's a plan that they could have done when they were in government. They failed to do so, and now they carp from the sidelines when somebody else is actually getting on with the job. And then let me just say finally, as somebody who's of an ethnic minority background myself, I do not stand for any differential treatment before the law for anyone of any kind, and there will never be a two-tier sentencing approach under my watch or under this Labour government.
Chair of the Select Committee, Andy Slaughter.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate the Lord Chancellor on the figures she's announced and on starting to get to grips with her baleful inheritance, but there's a long way to go. The Lady Chief Justice told the Law's Constitution Committee last week that she was pressing for Crown Courts to sit to capacity. Does the 110,000 figure represent capacity? If not, what is capacity? And given the backlog is 73,000 cases and rising, will she guarantee sitting days up to capacity for the whole of the coming year? In her statement, she rightly promises investment in the family and civil courts to bring those jurisdictions at or close to maximum capacity. Will she make the same commitment for the Crown Court?
Well, he will know that there is a difference between the system capacity and what is termed maximum judicial capacity. He is right, the Lady Chief Justice has said that the maximum judicial capacity is 113,000 sitting days in the Crown. We are funding 110,000 sitting days in the Crown. That is because I, in my role as Lord Chancellor, have to be mindful of the wider system capacity that can be managed. That is to say, the availability not just of the judges to sit in the Crown Court, but also the lawyers, the prosecutors, the availability of legal aid and the defence barristers that underpin the rest of the system as well. I am confident that the 110,000 sitting days represents the system capacity, and that is what is being delivered.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Josh Babrin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tens of thousands of victims and survivors waiting for their day in court is one of the darkest legacies of the last Conservative government. I sincerely feel this because under that Conservative government, I was one of those victims. After 2 decades of agonising over whether to report my own victimhood as a child, I waited 2 years for my own opportunity to seek justice in the Crown Court. That's years of your heart racing whenever you get a phone call from an unknown number. Is it the court? Is it the CPS? Years of anxiety that your perpetrator will retaliate. Years of your life excruciatingly on hold. But many victims today are being forced to sit with all of this for far longer than I did. And so Liberal Democrats and myself personally welcome the Justice Secretary's announcement today. But we all know that a huge backlog will still remain, which means victims and survivors will continue to be let down. And at a time when victims and survivors need more support during these agonising waits, government funding cuts and the NICS increases are putting services like Safeline and victim support at risk. So will the Lord Chancellor outline year by year her targets for reducing this backlog, and will she increase, not cut, support for charities to ensure that victims and survivors get the support that they need and deserve?
So State.
Can I thank the member, the honourable gentleman, for his remarks and pay tribute to the bravery that he has shown in his own personal life as he has sought justice for the crimes committed against him. His journey reflects that of many people, too many people across our country. I have my own constituency experience of the people I represent directly whose cases are trapped in the Crown Court backlog, so I hear regularly of the impact that it is having, and I'm very alive to the human cost of that Crown Court's backlog. That is why, at every available opportunity, I have sought to make progress in increasing funding and allocation in year, and also this record settlement for the next year. But of course, I know we need to go further. I know we need to do more. That is why the work of Sir Brian Leveson is so crucial, because we know that without reform, no matter how much you sit to in the Crown Court, that backlog is still going to rise. And I hope that when that review reports, I can count on support for that reform from across this House. All that want to see the Crown Court backlog come down will want to do so, I hope. I would just say to him on victims funding, we have protected funding for victims of rape and serious sexual offences, as well as domestic abuse. That funding is ring-fenced, and we will shortly be setting out our victims bill, which will have further measures in it to strengthen the victims code. And he asks about targets and timelines, and forgive me, this was also a point raised by the Shadow Justice Secretary. I have committed to once-in-a-generation reform of our Crown Courts. Once the review that Sir Brian Leveson is conducting has reported and the government has made decisions on the recommendations it will take forward and has got ready legislation, we will be able to set out the impact of future legislation in terms of bringing down that Crown Courts backlog.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm absolutely flabbergasted with some of the things that the Shadow Minister has said today. I can assure him that this backlog has not just materialised over the last 8 months. I can say that. I can say that as a Crown prosecutor that worked throughout the last 14 years under this last government, where we saw the waiting lists go up and up and up, despite the best efforts of the hard-working staff throughout the criminal justice service. So can the Lord Chancellor today confirm that the measures that she has announced today will finally allow victims, including those in my constituency of Amber Valley, to have some confidence that there's finally a government that is going to tackle this issue?
Thank my honourable friend for her question. Flabbergasted is one way of describing it. It's probably the only one that would be found in order for Mr. Speaker, so I shall refrain from using other language. She is a former prosecutor herself. She knows of what she speaks, and I pay tribute to the work that she did in her previous profession. I think the message should go out loud and clear to her constituents and people up and down this country. This government is acting to deal with the Crown Court's backlog. We have a plan, we've increased funding, and we're considering the reform that is needed that's been ducked by too many others to get this system sorted out once and for all.
Sir Julian Smith.
I refer the House to my register of voluntary interests. I welcome the statement. Would she agree that one way of getting cash into the criminal system is to reduce the cost of the civil system? And could I urge her to continue to look at methods of alternative dispute resolution and particularly mediation within the civil system?
I thank him for his comments. He's absolutely right. All mechanisms at our disposal to reduce the cost of people going to court should be on the table. We've already been acting to try and amplify the availability of mediation and other ways in which issues can be resolved. Going to court is always very expensive, sometimes for the individuals involved, often for the taxpayer, and it's important that we keep bearing down on those costs.
Rinda Juss.
First of all, please thank the Lord Chancellor for her honesty in laying out clearly the difficult situation that we have inherited from the party opposite. And I welcome the measures that she has proposed, the record investment in the justice system, and the measures taken to reduce the number of cases that will be going into the Crown Court. And it has got worse because of the party opposite. Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree that in addition to the measures that she has already proposed, that we should continue focusing on reducing crime in the first place, such as pursuing our policies of tackling youth crime, knife crime, and tackling violence against women and girls?
Well, my honourable friend is right that in order to deal with all of the problems within the criminal justice system, whether that's in policing, with prosecutors, with the situation in the Crown Courts, we need a system-wide approach, and that does mean taking action on the sorts of crimes that affect neighbourhoods up and down the country. That's why the Home Secretary's recent Crime and Policing Bill will be such a landmark piece of legislation. We all have to play our part because the criminal justice system has been left in a truly terrible state by the previous administration, and this government is getting on with the job of sorting it out.
Sir Christopher Cho.
This announcement is small beer, isn't it? The £92 million extra offered for criminal legal aid is exceeded 20-fold by the subsidies given to offshore wind, which is £1.9 billion last year alone. Why is it that the government has such perverse priorities? And when are we going to put the criminal justice system above the interests of offshore wind operators?
We're talking about the highest ever funded allocation in the Crown Courts at 110,000 Crown Court sitting days. That is a record. He says small beer. I wonder if he's been imbibing something before getting on his feet.
Cox.
Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome the Lord Chancellor's announcement of additional sitting days. The Justice Select Committee has been looking into the court backlog issue. We've also been hearing about the ongoing need for digitisation of court and wider criminal justice processes. We need to replace a creaking paper-based system which is contributing to those delays. So will the Lord Chancellor continue to support drives to successfully digitise these processes? And would she also join with me in congratulating the party opposite for marking International Women's Day with such style?
She's absolutely right on the point on digitisation and efficiency. I've already funded, after the first phase of the spending review ongoing work to improve digitisation within all of our courts processes. She's right, we absolutely need to move away from such paper-based and paper-heavy systems that we have at the moment. Part 2 of Brian Levison's work, which will report in autumn, will be looking at cross-system efficiency as well. She's absolutely right. We do need to increase productivity and efficiency because that is the final piece of the puzzle if we're going to sort out the backlog.
Okay. Gideon Amos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the extra sitting days? And I also welcome the announcements about reform, but I hope the right to trial by jury, the ancient right that we have in this country, will remain. But can I ask the Lord Chancellor particularly to look at Somerset's Crown Court in Taunton? It was closed in 2023, after work began in 2022, when items were falling on the heads of the court from the ceiling. We've just been told another whole year it will be closed. And whilst that is closed for another 12 months, victims of crime will have to travel tens and tens of miles further. We have even court users sleeping under a bush because they can't travel back and forth. We need to get our Crown Court open. Will she please look at expediting those works to get our Crown Court open again?
I thank the Honourable Member for his question. I'll make sure that he gets a meeting with the Courts Minister to talk about the situation in Taunton.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm slightly worried about the party opposite, who appear to be the arsonists, who are now complaining that the fire brigade is turning up too late to put out the fire when they were the one that set it in the first place. And I do worry that they don't understand the magnitude of the challenge and scale that they left behind, because I've heard it from people in my own constituency who have been waiting years to have a court case, which is getting worse. But the honourable gentleman should take. If the honourable gentleman would spend more time providing leadership rather than auditioning for it, he would own up to his own failures in this House, and he would say how much the Conservatives left this country in a mess. But what I wanted to ask the the Secretary of State is, courts aren't run just by judges. There is a lot of support staff in courts who make the court system run. So can she tell me what conversations she's had across government to make sure that those staff are also available, to make sure that as many courts are available as possible?
I think the Shadow Lord Chancellor is having such fun with his audition for leadership. It would be a shame to seek to deprive him of it. My honourable friend says they don't understand the party opposite, the mess they've left behind. I wonder, instead of they don't understand, they simply don't want to, because a party that was willing to reckon with the mistakes that they made in office would at least have started with some humility and perhaps an apology for the mess that they left behind. And he's right to point out that we're talking about a whole system approach. One of the reasons why the situation with the backlog is scheduled to get worse, no matter how many Crown Court sitting days you have, is because you've got an influx of cases into the system. That's actually a good thing because it means that the police are doing their job, prosecutions are being brought, but the rate of demand coming into the system is far outstripping, even at maximum capacity, the disposal of those cases. The case mix is more complex. It needs a system-wide response. That's what this government is providing.
Gavin Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When does the Lord Chancellor expect the additional places as being provided to start bearing down on the remand population?
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right to refer to the issues with the remand population. To deal with the issues with the remand population, which is growing, it's currently at 17,000, has a big impact on prison capacity. That's why I increased magistrates' court sentencing powers a few months ago. It's why I've increased Crown Court sitting days, and it's why we've got the record allocation next year. The demand coming into the system is one of the reasons why bearing down on remand has been particularly challenging, but it's something that we continue to work with the judiciary on. Listings are, of course, a matter for the independent judiciary.
Mr.
Speaker. I would have expected a little bit more humility from the benches opposite. They left a legacy of chaos in our prisons, huge court backlog, and what we're dealing with here fundamentally is the backlog that they left behind. And the Minister has set out a process for dealing with the growing backlog, but it's ultimately lays at the door of the Conservative Party, who left the place in chaos. So does my right honourable friend think, shouldn't we be hearing an apology from the people opposite, rather than claiming some...
Sorry does seem to be the hardest word for the party opposite. I have long since stopped waiting for that apology. All I would observe, and I say this with 14 years of opposition experience under my belt, parties that don't acknowledge their own mistakes and sort themselves out rarely get elected.
Yeah. Gavin Robbins.
Much, Mr. Speaker, and in welcoming the statement, can I say that it would reserve judgment on whether we need an additional court, an intermediary court, particularly if that's going to be resourced from the existing magistrates and Crown Court system. But can I ask the Lord Chancellor, particularly following on the question from Stratford, if we have a backlog in England, we have a backlog in Northern Ireland, and people are on remand for too long, increasingly people are being released following conviction with time served, and there's no opportunity for rehabilitation whatsoever. Will the opportunity to rehabilitate offenders whilst on remand form part of the Brian Levison review?
Well, look, he's absolutely right to raise the issues relating to remand. We do have a problem with the remand population. It's why I've already been making the changes that I've highlighted, and it's why the work of both reviews, the one being conducted by Sir Brian Levison, looking at once-in-a-generation court reform, and also by David Gorkin, the independent panel, looking at sentencing, is so crucial, because it is essential that not only do we bear down on the Crown Court backlog, but that we also get our prison capacity back into balance and have a sustainable prison system in this country.
Mr. Speaker, criminal justice was an easy target for Tory austerity cuts, and it always impacts the people with the smallest voice. Rape victims in Truro and Falmouth have come to me with waits of years for their cases to be heard and having hearings cancelled at the last minute. So I very much welcome this investment. I would ask for more detail on the case for a new court to sit between the magistrates and the Crown and how that may work.
On the possibility of a court that sits between the magistrates and the Crown, that's something that Sir Brian is considering, and she'll understand why I would want to wait until he has made his recommendations. But it's one of a range of options of different ways in which we could change policy in order to bear down in the long term on that Crown Court's backlog, and we will consider his recommendations and bring forward legislation for those that we want to take forward in the spring. And let me just say, look, I absolutely hear what she's saying about the terrible experience of victims who have their cases cancelled on the day, and the impact on rape victims in particular. It's one of the reasons why we've already gone ahead and fulfilled our manifesto commitment of having independent legal advisors for victims of rape, so that their specific rights in law are always protected.
Sir Ashley Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Lord Chancellor has been in office for 8 months today, and whilst her announcement of additional sitting days is welcome, it is regrettable she didn't make this statement 7 months ago. There is only so long that she can blame the last government for the Crown Court backlog. We all know that the pandemic was largely responsible for the very substantial increase. We know that the Lady Chief Justice has offered the Lord Chancellor a further 2,500 sitting days. Would she say why she's not taking advantage of that? There are currently too many people on remand for too long. And it's clear that even the announcement she's made today will not lead to a reduction in the backlog. So we need a structural change. So will the Lord Chancellor give serious consideration to the creation of an intermediate court, so that we can reduce this backlog more quickly?
I would just gently remind him that the Concordat process that I have concluded with the announcements today is earlier than the one that I inherited from his party. So we have been cracking on. I've been getting on with the job. I increased sitting days immediately. I've taken every opportunity to increase sitting days further, and I've now made a record allocation. He says that the Lady Chief Justice has offered more sitting days. He'll know, of course, the Lady Chief Justice isn't able to offer sitting days. What she's able to comment on is maximum judicial capacity, which she has done so as is appropriate, in order to make sure that those sitting days are capable of being sat in the Crown Court. I have to consider the wider system capacity issues. That is about the availability of legal aid, it's about prosecutors, it's about defence barristers as well. That is why at the unprecedented record level of 110,000 Crown Court sitting days, I can say the system overall, not just judicial capacity, but the overall system has the capacity to meet these days.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Public Accounts Committee published a report in which said the Razzo case, that's the rape and serious sexual offences, were taking so many years to come to trial. When I was a Shadow Justice Minister for a number of years, at that dispatch box, I was asking the previous government day in, day out, as to what they were doing to try to reduce the court delays. 14 years, they did nothing. Now, this Lord Chancellor, in 8 months, has provided 110,000 court sitting days. So, would the Lord Chancellor agree with me that the expression that comes to mind is the case of the pot calling the kettle black?
I can tell my honourable friend that many expressions have come to mind as I've been listening. Some of the drivel from some of the members opposite, not all of which will not fall foul of Erskine May, so I will keep my counsel on that. She does refer to the Public Accounts Committee report, and I will just gently observe, I was a long-term member of that committee myself. I have the highest regard for the Public Accounts Committee, but I do reject the criticism they have made, because this is a government that clearly has a plan, not just on funding and resources for the Crown Court, but also on the reform that will ultimately be needed to get the system into balance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Despite this announcement, the backlog will increase, but when cases do go to court, it's important that offenders serve the sentence they're given. So following the Lord Chancellor's trip to Texas, where some prisoners serve as little as 25% of their sentence, will she rule out adopting such a soft sentencing policy?
Well, what I would say to him is that the experience of the Texans, who had similar problems to what we face today, but they had theirs 20 years or so ago, is that the system of good behaviour credits, which incentivises offenders to engage in rehabilitation activity, to get help for their drug addictions or their alcohol problems, mental health issues and so on, if they engage with that and get their good behaviour credits, that is how they earn their way to an earlier parole hearing. It isn't... It is the definition of a tough system, because it says to offenders, you have to do something good in order to earn the possibility of an earlier release. It is a system that is well worth learning from, because their reoffending rates are very low compared to ours. One of the prisons I visited in Texas has a reoffending rate of 17%. I would dream of that number for us here in this country, because every time we bear down on reoffending, that is cutting crime, and it's a strategy for making sure we have fewer victims in the future. I would hope that whatever proposals we bring forward, if they lead to a reduction in reoffending, those are proposals that he would back.
Mr. Speaker, in June 2024, in the dying days of the last Conservative government, and after 14 years of their rule, there emerged a shocking statistic. 60% of rape victims were withdrawing from the court process, mainly because of court delays. Isn't that a damning indictment on any government that has taken power in this country? And what is she doing as a result of today's announcement that will help reduce that awful decision taken by so many rape victims?
He's absolutely right. The figures that he notes are a damning indictment of the legacy of the last Conservative government. The announcement we've made today will bear down on that court's backlog, and it will mean some rape victims get their cases heard as cases move through the system more swiftly. It's also why we've already implemented our manifesto commitment on independent legal advisors, because we know that in addition to delays, one of the things that causes many rape victims to drop out is inappropriate inappropriate requests for personal information that go beyond what the law requires. And so those independent legal advisors will ensure that the rights in law of rape victims are respected and that the process does not feel like it is re-traumatising women who are already going through so much and who are waiting for their day in court to have